Ivory in the Blood, written by Brian A. Hopkins, published in Dragon Magazine, issue 158 in June 1990, read by A.J. Pickett. Garrick heard their approach. The tranquil morning air distinctly carried the sounds of war harness and armour, yet he rose and went to the yard unarmed. Though he had lifted no weapon in more than 8 years, it still felt uncomfortable to greet any visitor thus. More so with visitors such as these, who obviously were not interested in good fellowship and ale. The riders drew to a halt, destroying much of the yard he had worked so hard to cultivate. One horse sidestepped into the flower bed, trampling the flowers Alfreda had planted years ago. The rider forced the horse back into the yard, doing more damage than if he had held his ground. Once they were stopped the nearest, just short of trampling Garrick where he stood, there was an eerie silence, soon broken by the lead rider. His voice was powerful, stern, and direct. Even the horses stood fast while his breath smoked in the morning air. "If Garrick ap Alden be your name, then I have business with you in the name of Owain Skarga, Lord of Cairglass." Garrick braced himself, knowing full well the type of man he baited. "I speak with no man through helm, nor with whom I know not." The mounted warrior's hand went immediately to the longsword at his side. Habit, that much Garrick could tell. This was not a man accustomed to being greeted with belligerence, but for a moment Mail Gauntlet rested on the hilt. Then he seemed to retreat somewhat in the saddle. The hand left the sword and went to the visor. The faceplate lifted with no sound at all. A man who cared for his armour, or one who could afford new when he chose, or one whose armour had never seen the outdoors. Garrick ruled out all save the first when he saw the steel-grey eyes of his visitor. This was a man of war. Moreover, this was a man who had seen war, and perhaps something else as well. There was a weariness back of those grey orbs that went beyond mere bloodshed on the battlefield. "I am Rhys, commander of Lord Owain's armies. I've been sent from Cairglass to find ap Alden for one they call the Dragon Slayer." "If it's the slaying of dragons you're after, then you've come to the wrong place." Leather creaked and the warhorse snorted as Rhys swung down from the saddle. "Are you or are you not Garrick ap Alden?" "I am he." Riders shifted in the yard, nigh 20 men flanking left and right, as if they thought he would attempt something. Garrick was both amused and annoyed to learn that his reputation was animate, even after an 8-year lapse. Rhys reached up with both hands and completely removed his helm, bracing it under his right arm. He crossed the short distance separating them and offered his left hand in greeting. The left hand, leaving the right free to draw sword or long knife. These thoughts passed through Garrick's mind like recollections of old friends. Garrick chose to ignore the offered hand, both to bait the man and because a handshake through a mail gauntlet irritated him as much as talking through the helm. Rhys withdrew his hand and retreated a step. Sword's reach, Garrick thought to himself. It would appear that legends leave out details such as rudeness, Rhys remarked sourly. "You've not come for my hospitality," Garrick fired back. "You bring men of war, men who have obviously failed at something you hope I will succeed at." Rhys frowned. "Direct, then." "No other way." "We have a problem at Cairglass, obviously, for which we require your unique talents. Have the peasants finally risen against your tyrannical lord?" Though Garrick had never met Lord Owain, he had ample experience in dealing with feudal lords. There were exceptions to the rule, but most were pompous and unjust, supported by the peasants unlucky enough to fall within their domain. There was a shuffling of weapons and several curses from the warriors in their semicircle of steel. Tyrant or not, they were loyal to this man Owain. Perhaps Garrick's arrow had flown off target with that remark. Rhys surprised him completely by laughing. "You don't leave many outs for yourself, do you, Dragon Slayer? Once you've done with insulting us and our lord, we'll be ready to kill you if you refuse to help. As it stood before, you might have had some chance of refusing us and keeping your head on your shoulders." Garrick swallowed that and realized 8 years of peaceful solitude had yielded an appreciation for life. "Ask then." "No," Rhys responded. "Lord Owain requests your presence. Whatever aid is asked of you, he will ask it. Get what you need." Garrick shrugged. "I need only the clothes on my back." I think not, Dragon Slayer. What then? Whatever weapons and armour you'll need. Though he knew and had known since the sound of their approach had echoed up through the canyons, Garrick asked anyway. What weapons? Rhys smiled. Why, whatever weapons you use to slay a dragon. It loomed dark in the distance, a towering, malignant structure, grey castle, Caer Glas in the Celtic tongue. It was visible for an hour before they actually reached the gates of black iron. Don't see how a dragon could bother you much in this, Garrick remarked to his companions. It's not us it's bothering, Rhys answered. It's the peasants. Score another one for this Lord Owain, Garrick thought to himself. He cares about his serfs. Elfreda, my love. How have I become so cynical over the years? Of course, there was no answer. She'd been dead nearly 2 years now. Sometimes he still caught himself talking to her. Behind him the wagon creaked as it hauled his weapons and armour. Rhys insisted that the gear be hauled in a wagon they had bought and left waiting below the ascent to Garrick's cottage. Armour, sword and lance had all been retrieved from the resting place beneath the floor of the house. Rhys's men had been adamant that Garrick not have the opportunity to touch anything. Despite their curiosity, Rhys had seen to it that none of his own men had opened the oilskin-wrapped items. At the castle, Rhys was hailed from above, and, once he was identified, the gates swung open and the iron portcullis was hauled up. Garrick remarked on the castle's defences. There was a time when we saw many wars in these valleys, Dragon Slayer. There's been peace for the last 5 years, but we don't lessen our vigilance. Garrick made no comment, and Rhys continued. Caer Glas has withstood 4 different sieges since it was built. And one dragon has you at a loss? It's hard to fight something that moves only at night and lives beneath the ground. Then you know of its lair. Rhys drew his horse to a halt in a courtyard, ignoring the question. Stablemen rushed forward to take both their horses. Garrick noticed the soldiers took care of their own mounts. He awarded them some small measure of respect for that. Dismounting, Garrick patted his horse's neck. It was a good, strong war horse. No Ryagan, but a good horse all the same. He longed for the companionship of his old friend nearly as much as he longed for Elfreda. However, Ryagan wouldn't be needed this time, since Rhys obviously knew of the dragon's lair. There would be no mounted charge in the open. It would be your typical cave encounter. Go down, find the dragon, irritated enough to get it to charge, brace slants, and let it do the rest, while you hoped and prayed your armour withstood the heat. Later, burnt and blistered, he'd take the head up for the people. It took a minute before Garrick realised he was suddenly thinking in terms of actually fighting the dragon. Why was he doing this? Years ago he'd laid his weapons beneath the floorboards of his cottage and retired. Keep your wits about you, old son, he told himself. You're too old and much too soft for this kind of work. This way, Rhys interrupted Garrick's thoughts. Garrick followed him through an archway across a smaller courtyard and from there up a series of stone steps leading to Lord Owain's audience chamber. Owain had evidently been told of their arrival, for he was waiting. He rose and extended his hand to Garrick. Garrick surprised himself by taking it. Owain was a strong, amicable-looking fellow, not at all the tyrant Garrick had envisaged Caer Glas would produce. Garrick decided it was time to make amends. My lord Skarga, I am Garrick ab Alden. How may I be of service? Please sit over here, and I'll have wine brought in. You must be thirsty after the ride. Owain led him to a large table to one side and away from the formal audience area. Rhys, send the wine in on your way out. Rhys frowned at that dismissal, but left all the same. Garrick and Lord Owain seated themselves at the table. A loyal man, Rhys Briandon, but he has failed to deliver in this matter. Oh, not for want of trying, mind you. I have no complaints. The wine was brought in by an older woman dressed in simple but sturdy clothing. She poured for both, serving Garrick first. He waited until she had left before repeating his question to Owain. My lord, I was brought here under some duress. I must insist that you explain. Owain took one long drink of his wine, leaned back in his chair, and began. 3 months ago, there was a tremor in the foothills east of here. That tremor unearthed something. Perhaps it had been waiting there for many years, or perhaps the avalanches that followed the quake simply woke it. I've heard tales about them hibernating for centuries. He looked Garrick dead in the eyes. We are speaking, of course, of a dragon. 8 years ago, Garrick replied, I scoured the land in search of dragons. Your own father was one of the 6 or so men who funded the search. I found nothing. At the time, we were convinced there were no dragons left. And you retired, the last of the dragon slayers. By that time, the only dragon slayer who had lived to retirement. The evening following the quake, several farmers reported missing cattle. We assumed it to be thieves. The thefts went on. A week later, a young peasant woman disappeared. Days later, a shepherd and half his flock vanished. It continued, with Rhys and his men investigating every step of the way. In time, they laid traps, and eventually one paid off. It came. Garrick saw it in his mind, not Rhys and his men specifically, but others who had set traps for something they didn't understand. They staked out cattle or sheep, with the men trying to remain hidden, but oh so visible to an airborne beast with hawk-like vision. They would be bored, for this was not the first night they had watched the trap, nor would it be the first night the dragon had watched them. It would know the trap on first sight, and it would wait, knowing the nature of men from eons of watching him evolve. In the dark mist of early morning, the dragon would strike from the air, killing those who didn't flee quickly enough. Sure, they would fight, but with weapons they used on other men. Crossbows with quarrels that would bounce from rotilium scales, and swords whose edges were meant to turn other blades. Better to fight with a skinning knife that would at least scratch the hide, than bludgeon it with a blade meant to pound armor. The dragon would feed that night on human flesh, ignoring the tethered bait. How many times had he heard such tales? Had his fee ever been exorbitant enough that they need try it on their own? Owain seemed to sense that Garrick knew what had happened and didn't go into details of their failure with the trap. Less than half escaped that night. Rhys' own brother was among those slaughtered. For him, it's been a personal battle ever since, a vendetta that has paid off, for Rhys followed it back to its lair. Forgive me if I'm sceptical, Lord Owain, but that is not an easy thing to do. No horse I've ever seen can keep up with a dragon in flight. This dragon doesn't fly, it's too old, so old that the wings have atrophied. I've never seen anything so huge. Yes, I was there that night and I saw it, nor would I have ever thought something that big could move so fast. They will surprise you, Garrick patronized. No, I've seen others. I even saw you slay one about 16 years ago. You hunted it for Lord Darren of Cornwall. I was among those who watched from a distance when you ran it down. The dragon of Cornwall could have sat with ease upon our dragon's knee. Garrick wanted to laugh, but couldn't. Surely you jest, my lord. I recall the encounter, unique in the fact the dragon chose to fight in the daylight, thus providing theatre for hundreds, yourself among them. But that was a mature dragon. Hell, the beast was so big and brown he would have been mistaken for a fair-sized hill had he gone to ground somewhere. That was no small green I slew in Cornwall that day. Owain swallowed the last of his wine. I know. Cornwall's dragon must have gone, 3 rots? Our dragon is nearly twice that long. Garrick said nothing, setting his empty goblet aside. Owain continued. Rhys and 30 men tracked it to its lair, Rhys, and 20 of them went down after it. Hours later, Rhys came out, dragging 2 wounded. The rest perished. It was then we sought you. I can tell you what I know of slaying such beasts, Lord Owain. Owain seemed not to hear him. I want you to kill it. We have checked. You are the last man alive who knows their weaknesses. You are the last with the skill to meet it and succeed. My lord, for more than 8 years the battles I have fought have been in my garden. I am an old man. Dozens of old wounds prevent me from moving freely before midday. I cannot go in there after your dragon. Then we are lost. We have encountered the last dragon, but there is no last dragon slayer after all. Owain half rose from his seat. Must I show you what's left of those who have fallen to this nightmare? Is it the money? Name your price, man. I'll pay anything for the safety of my hold and my people. Garrick ran his finger idly around the rim of his empty wine goblet. His mind drifted again, and he saw other meetings where fees had been discussed long before anyone cared where the dragon was or what the dragon had done. Meetings where princes and barons seeking adventure had hired him to simply hunt down a dragon. Never mind whether dragons had ever done anything. It was game, like a deer or fox, and Garrick had served as a huntsman more often than he cared to recall. But here was a man struggling to protect his people. Here was a dragon rumoured to be nearly twice the size of any Garrick had ever encountered. Here was a dragon that had gone from slaughtering cattle and sheep for food to killing peasants. Here was the last dragon, and here was the last man alive who had ever slain one. The wagon creaked to a halt, and Rhys pointed up to a crumbling ridge. "There," he said. "Look to the right of that fallen spire. See it?" Garrick forced back an involuntary shudder. Dragons liked the entrances to their lair to be tight-fitting. He'd seen dozens of them, and they had piled rocks around the entrances until they could just barely squeeze through. He hypothesized that they did this to make their lairs easier to defend. If this one followed suit, then it was one hell of a big dragon, easily twice the size of the Dragon of Cornwall, as Owain had said. "I see it." Rhys jumped down from the wagon. "Let's get started." Garrick looked back at him and frowned. "One thing needs to be made clear now, or I stay in this wagon. I'm going in there after that ugly brown bastard alone." Without answering, Rhys dropped the tailgate on the wagon. "Do we have an understanding?" "Yes," Rhys mumbled. "One thing you should know. He's gold, not brown." Garrick swallowed that with everything else he had heard about this extraordinary last dragon. Everyone knew young dragons were green. What they looked like at birth was anyone's guess, since no one had ever managed to track down a lair with young. It was assumed from studies made on the reproductive organs of dead dragons that they were egg layers. Garrick had always dreamed of finding a cache of dragon eggs, but it had never happened. As the dragon matures, the green eventually darkens and becomes a rusty brown. The brown eventually reaches the colour of rich mud in the mature dragons of about 3 to 4 rods in length, or at least in what Garrick had always assumed was a mature dragon. Perhaps with age the brown faded to gold. Perhaps adolescent dragons were all mankind had encountered, until now. The dragon slayer swung down and joined Rhys at the rear of the wagon. Rhys handed him the longest of the oilskin-wrapped packages which had been hauled from Garrick's home in the mountains. Garrick unwrapped it. The lance was longer than any Rhys had ever seen before, measuring a half-rod or more. The package had been deceptive, since the lance was wrapped as 2 pieces, shaft and blade. The blade itself was 8 hands long. Rhys watched as Garrick mounted the head over the shaft and then inserted pins to hold it into place. The pins took some hammering, for which they used Rhys's dagger. When the lance was assembled, Garrick extended it to Rhys, and the Careglass warlord took it in reverent hands. "Not the sort of weapon one would carry into battle," Rhys commented as he felt the slender blade. "Any heavy weapon would shatter this blade. Why is it so thin?" "Feel the edge." Rhys ran his finger carefully over the edge and yelped. "Sharper than anything I've ever seen before. Can't even touch it without cutting myself." "The dragon's hide is scales, tougher than your own armor. This blade is razor sharp and thin enough to slide through those scales and find its heart. You get one chance, one thrust. If the blade turns or shatters or misses its heart, you're a dead man. With one claw it'll crush you like a bug, or those mighty jaws will lock around your body and bite you in half. Or if it's feeling particularly playful, it might just roast you alive. Most dragon slayers died because they missed with the lance." "This is long enough to reach its heart?" Rhys asked, indicating the 8-hand blade. Garrick frowned. "It's long enough to kill any normal-sized dragon. As for your overgrown friend in there..." Next, the dragon slayer unwrapped his sword and withdrew it from the plain leather sheath. Like the lance, it was different from anything Rhys had ever seen. The blade was wider than that of even the stoutest broadsword, very thick and heavy in the centre. The blade then tapered down to the thinnest, sharpest edge imaginable. Garrick slid it back into the sheath. "Your own weapon would shatter the edges of this blade if I were to attack you with it. It was ridiculous of you to keep me from them when we left my home. I had no way of knowing. No matter. I like a man who takes every precaution when confronting the unknown." Garrick handed the sword to Rhys. "Careful if you unleash it. That blade is made for cutting a dragon's neck." Garrick continued to unwrap the rest of the packages. They proved to be armour not much different from Rhys's own, albeit heavier by about 40 pounds. There was other subtle differences, like the double visor, the inside one slotted for vision while the outer was solid to protect the eyes, or the hooks on the inside of the greaves, which Garrick explained were used to cling to a dragon in battle. As he suited up, the Dragon Slayer explained other differences to Rhys Briandon. Rhys didn't realise it, but what he was watching, no one would ever see again. Armoured, Garrick upheld and belted the sword about his waist. Though he was a tall man, the tip of the blade nearly reached the ground. He took the lance from Rhys, collected a torch from a pile of them in the wagon, and looked up the hill. "Do not follow me in, Briandon, no matter what you hear. Understand?" Rhys nodded. With the hilt of his dagger, he struck a spark from a piece of flint, lighting Garrick's torch. If I don't come out, either we have slain each other or it has won. Probably the latter. Your best bet then is to try and seal the cave. With that, Garrett ap Alden turned and began the short ascent to the entrance of the dragon's lair. He remembered the first time he'd stood thus before a dark cavern entrance. He'd been 9 years old, and with Alden, his father. Son, what I do now I do for the sake of those townsfolk back there. Never think there is any glory in this profession. I don't do it for fame, and as you well know, I only charge enough that you and your mother may live comfortably. There's an evil on this earth, son, and we've been given the power to remove it. The tall Celt had looked down at the youth that just barely topped his waistline. I know you don't understand, son, but that creature down there is one of the devil's minions. It's my duty to destroy it. Alden had emerged from that lair, dragging behind him the severed head of a rather small brown dragon. He'd rolled it down the hill to the waiting townsmen, who'd stared at it in terror as if it had some power over them. Then their stares had gone from terror to awe as they looked up the hill to their deliverer. Garrick tried to recall how many times he had stood before the entrance to a dragon's lair since that first time. He couldn't. This time was only marginally different. The dragon lance was clutched in his left fist, and the dragon sword hung at his side. The differences? Well, there was no Reagan waiting below to carry him home, and there was no Elfreda to dress his wounds when he got there. Both visors were up, and he felt the wind on his face. He smelled flowers nearby. What was it that his father had once told him? Son, every time I go down in one of these holes, I think what a fine day it is to die. He had never been sure what his father meant by that until the first time he had gone down alone. Before he went down, he had stood, tasting the wind-borne smells of life, and understanding had come in a rush. It was indeed a good day to pass from this world to the next. Lance and sputtering torch held out before him, Garrick ap Alden entered the lair of the last dragon. There had been times when he had to take the lance down in parts, but not this time. There was plenty of room, even for the lance. This was an immense opening. The damp dark of the lair enveloped. The great head rises from its resting place on the stone floor. Golden eyelids go up, revealing emerald orbs. The dragon's eyes scintillate in the glow from the cavern's natural skylight. The tail thrashes in irritation, then is abruptly still. Nostrils flare, emanating wisps of sulphurous smoke that curl languidly in the still cave air.
He has come.
Though it has felt fear before, the dragon feels none now. This is destiny. The dragon has been awaiting this moment for a decade. Minutes later, the dragon can hear him as well as smell him. For a human, he moves with incredible stealth, yet he is only a man, and an armoured one at that. A long forked tongue lashes out, and a few drops of liquid flame bespatter the nearby rock. The dragon rises on silent feet and turns to face the cavern's southern entrance. Here the cave meets a natural tunnel. The walls are covered with dried blood, and the cave is littered with the dented metal remains of those who came hunting before.
This man is different.
He is not the first. Others of his calling have met this dragon on a variety of battlegrounds. All those are dead. This man is the last. Fate has brought them together at this point in time, a predestination set in motion when first their races met and exchanged blows.
The final confrontation has come.
Warm air rose to meet him, and after a few moments of descent, he lowered the first of his helm's visors. The air was moist. Perhaps a natural spring lay somewhere deep beneath the surface, kept warm by that which swam in it. It waited. Somehow he knew it was aware of him, even when he was sure the sounds of his approach had not yet reached it. There was a sensation within him that he had never felt before. As he was sure the dragon was aware of him, he was just as aware of it. The dark tunnel twisted and weaved, yet he had no trouble navigating it in the dark. He felt as if he could easily toss aside the torch. It was as if he had passed this way before. With a shudder, he realized that it was somehow calling him. The dragon, not he, had passed this way many times, knew every turn in this dim passageway. But was it guiding him, or was he somehow one with the beast that waited? There was a sound from below, something reptilian sliding across rock, and the click of claws. It had turned to face him. How did he know this? A gust of hot wind against his face, and he knew it wasn't far away. A few more turns, and he would meet the moor from which this foul breath issued. His foot rocked something metal, and he looked down to find a battered breastplate. Beneath it lay a halberd, the shaft broken. The halberd was unbloodied. The same could not be said of the breastplate. The next turn in the passageway brought him to what was a small alcove to the lair, and the scene of a massacre. Strewn about the cavern were the battered remains of armour and the blackened bones of a score of warriors. Now visible was the last turn. Around that, he knew, the dragon lay in wait. He could feel its breath wafting around the bend. The walls ahead reflected lambent fire that did not originate from his torch. He knew it was laughing. Laughing? Why? Garrick dropped the torch and gripped the lance firmly in both hands. Did the dragon know something about this predestined encounter that he did not? For a moment he had the strangest feeling that he had been here before. This was a cavern he had walked more than once, maybe not in this life, but in a myriad of others. He had turned that corner before, and it had always been the same. He would turn the corner. Moving forward, just place one foot ahead of the other, with the lance extended and ready. One hand ready to drop the second visor to shield his eyes if need be. Come face to face with the dragon, golden nostrils flaring and emerald eyes penetrating to the core of him, and turn the corner. And the dragon would say,
"And so, he has arrived."
Garrick braced the butt of his lance. The sense of déjà vu had left him, and he was now in his element. "Charge!" he bid the golden monstrosity before him. But the dragon rested casually, tail curled around and over its forelegs, content to see what the intruder would do. This was unlike any lair encounter he had experienced before. Typically, dragons attack upon invasion of their domain. It was this characteristic which all dragon slayers used to their advantage. The charge, the braced lance, the impaled dragon, and then the hacking with the sword. This dragon followed none of the norms, and what's more, it had talked to him.
"Welcome, Garrick Eberron."
He lowered the lance and raised the helm's visor. "You know my name," he stammered.
"The last dragon slayer. How could I, the last dragon, not know of you?"
"You know I was coming?"
"Before you did, human,"
the dragon replied. "And you know why I've come?"
"Better than you do, human."
Garrick ignored the cryptic answers and chose instead to examine both the dragon and the cavern in which it rested. Both were huge, but there the similarities stopped. The cavern was dark, black igneous rock born of fire. The dragon was gold, aureate brilliance born of sunlight. The worm was indeed bigger than any he had ever seen, easily measuring the 6 rods attested by Lord Owain. As Owain had said, its wings were atrophied. If this dragon could fly at all, it would be only for short distances. The head was a broad triangle, horns of silver, eyes of emerald, and fangs of ivory that dripped a liquid conflagration. The dragon's pupils were pools of tenebrous gloom, its claws were penumbrous ebony, worn little by the rocky cavern floor. The cavern itself had 2 points of access, the tunnel at Garrick's back, and another, similar opening that lay beyond the dragon, roughly circular. The cavern measured approximately 20 rods in diameter. Room for several more dragons, even ones this size. Garrick, however, had his hands full with just one. He realized he'd been gawking for several minutes while the dragon waited patiently. Where was the demon he had come to slay? Where was the beast his father raised him to fear and hate? "I don't understand," was all he found to say.
"You've come to slay me,"
the dragon responded bluntly.
"What don't you understand about that?"
Sweat trickled down his back. It was hot in the lair, and the armor was becoming damn uncomfortable. He decided to be more assertive and took a grip on the lance. "You've overstepped your bounds, worm. Cattle and sheep are one thing, but the peasants are something else."
"Ah, the farmer's daughter that disappeared."
"And the young shepherd."
"Who can tell you more about her whereabouts than I ever be able to.
What do you mean? The dragon sighed, causing Garrick to jump as flames gouted forth. They splashed harmlessly to his left, though, and he was somewhat embarrassed for his reaction. Lance lowered again. He listened to the dragon's answer.
Why was it so easy to steal sheep from that young shepherd?
The dragon did his best impression of a human's grin. The attempt, however, was wasted on Garrick.
Because he was busy sneaking off from his flock every night to see the farmer's daughter. The two of them got tired of bedding in the farmer's barn and finally ran off together, hence their disappearance.
Garrick surprised himself. Why do I believe you? More flame, this time a laugh which even Garrick recognized.
Perhaps before this night is through, you can answer that question yourself.
The dragon slayer looked down at his lance and frowned. What am I doing here? He moved to the tavern wall and leaned the lance there, the dragon following his every move. Sweat ran down into Garrick's eyes, and again he cursed the armor.
Take it off,
prompted the dragon. That'd certainly make it easy, he replied sarcastically. Again, the strange sound of the dragon's laughter.
If I wanted you dead, Eberron, dead you'd be.
That sunk in. This beast was nearly twice the size of the largest dragon Garrick had ever killed, the dragon of Brunwyn. The lance hadn't been long enough to reach that dragon's heart. How could he expect it to reach this one's? There was the dragon's sword at his side, but it had barely triumphed over Brunwyn's dragon. Time to decide, he told himself. Do I hurl myself at this dragon and try to take him with me to hell, or do I see where all this is leading? What would Father have done? And then, fast on the heels of that last thought, Father's long dead. He removed his helmet, eyes on the dragon at all times. This laid aside, he unbuckled the belt holding the sword about his waist. The sword he unsheathed, pleased as something he judged as nervousness passed through those emerald eyes before he leaned it against the lance. He sat down then and began the job of removing 120 pounds of armour alone. The dragon laid its head across its forelegs and seemed content to watch for a moment. Then abruptly it asked,
How many of my kind have you slain?
Garrick looked up from the greave he was unbuckling. Why the hell was he removing his armour in front of this monstrosity? 37. The last more than 8 years ago in the hills of North Haven. Why did it feel like a confession?
And your father before you?
Some say he slew over 100 dragons in his lifetime. I think the actual figure was around 70. He never did say. Then accusingly, a dragon friend of yours ripped him limb from limb when I was only 15. Both greaves off, Garrick laid them aside and started on the buckles above his knees.
There were more of us in those days,
the dragon reminisced.
You humans breed like vermin. A dragon takes hundreds of years before he reaches maturity and seeks out a mate. Time was on your side, human.
We had to protect ourselves, Garrick countered.
And we had to eat,
was the quick reply. It didn't have to start as it did. Somewhere, hundreds of years ago, when man and dragon met for the first time, the dragon could have spoken up.
Was he given the chance?
But 37 times I've confronted one of you, and not once did a dragon say, I think there's been some mistake.
Maybe there was no mistake,
the dragon said.
Maybe our two races were destined to war, mine to lose, and the two of us to meet here, where I guard a treasure beyond belief.
Garrick's eyes darted to the opening behind the dragon. Treasure? It was a myth, a peasant's daydream. Never had he found anything of value in a dragon's lair. The look did not escape the dragon.
In due time, human.
Armour set aside, Garrick sat back against the cavern wall, both more and less at ease without the 120 pounds of steel weighing on his body. If the dragon made its move now, he was a dead man. But had he ever been otherwise? For whatever good it would do him, his sword was within reach, as was the now useless lance.
You leave today with no weapons, Garrick Eberron,
the dragon hissed, reading either his mind or his intentions.
You walk out of here more than a warrior today, more than the slayer of dragons that you were.
Explain. Flames of irritation.
If You leave these caverns. You leave without that armor, without these weapons, without my head.
All this in exchange for...
The treasure behind me.
Garrick rose to his feet. Seems I should take a look at this treasure. The dragon also rose, more movement than Garrick had yet seen from the beast. It didn't move to block his path to the lair's second exit. Rather, it seemed to be moving to a vantage point from which it could watch Garrick enter the treasure room. Garrick realized as he approached the dark entrance that he was now out of reach of his weapons. Small concern, however, since the dragon's movement had effectively cut him off. He was forced to duck to enter the dark antechamber. As he crossed the threshold, the dragon extended one forelimb and rested a claw the size of Garrick's forearm on his shoulder.
Harm her, and you'll not die a quick death, Eberron. That I promise you.
He entered. It was a small cave, lit only with light from the larger chamber, reflected by the golden dragon. Shadows concealed everything, and he was about to turn about when the dragon moved, and with it moved the reflected light. A shaft of that golden light fell across the floor, and there she lay, purest white, on a cloth of velvet black. She's real? Garrick managed to get out. At the sound of his voice, she raised her head, dispelling all doubts. Dark eyes met his, and he read some small measure of fear there. He showed her his empty hands, glad to be rid of both weapons and armor for this meeting. Does she have a name? He asked, his eyes locked with hers.
She hasn't said,
the dragon answered behind him. She's beautiful.
Magic. Stuff of legends like myself. The three of us are the last of our kinds. You, the warrior of old, born of honor and courage. Life wagered time and time again for the peace and quiet of farm folk and overfed lords. I, last of a race born 10,000 years before man, destined in the end to perish at their hands because we are not as prolific. And she, last of a race nearly as old as my own, cursed by human mythology be something she's not, and to die for it. The last.
Unicorn. Garrick scarcely breathed the word, mind still refusing to accept what his eyes saw. They had been legend all his life. He had never believed they existed, until now. The foal got to her feet, coat of purest white, matching hooves, mane and tail the same, long and full, looking just brushed 1,000 strokes, eyes that echoed impenetrable depths, matching nose, testing the air, and a horn that should not, by all laws of nature, be there. This was the treasure that confronted him. She was so small, couldn't be more than a few weeks old. Where did you...
A story that will never be told about him. Suffice to say, she was entrusted to me. She is the last.
What will you do with her?
Give her to you.
He turned then, full about to confront the golden face that peered at him and the unicorn. Give her to me?
That's what I said.
In exchange for armor, weapons, and your life. The dragon laughed, some of the resulting flames coming dangerously close to Garrick's feet. He did not, however, back up for fear of startling the fragile creature behind him.
I'm changing your life, human. Take this frail creature and do what I cannot. Raise her. Perhaps in years ahead, you'll find a way to curtail her species' extinction. For all I know, she'll breed true with your own horses.
The dragon paused.
My life, however, was never part of the bargain. Mine will continue to its own predestined end. Yours, on the other hand, will change. That change precludes the need for those items you've left in my lair.
Garrick turned back to face the spindly-legged apparition on the velvet spread. He extended a hand, and she first sniffed carefully, then nuzzled it. Her muzzle was soft and new. It brought unwelcome memories of himself as a child, and Reagan, this size, given as a present from his father.
I'm offering you a chance, Eberron, to right some of the wrongs you've done in your life. Help this creature. Show me that your race is more than butchers.
He knelt, and the unicorn moved against him. Seconds later, she melted into his arms.
You'll take her?
In answer, he enfolded the unicorn in his arms and got back to his feet. What will you do? He asked. Kerglas is bound to hunt you and... A warrior's scream of attack. the dragon turning on claws that tore loose hunks of solid rock, the foal squirming loose to run for the shadows of her small alcove, and the bright flicker of flame in the lair, all seemingly at once. Garrick whirled about so fast he turned an ankle on loose rock and went sprawling. As he scrambled to his feet, he heard the voice of Rhys Briandon and the roar of the dragon as one. "Die, worm from hell!" Rhys had the dragon lance clutched in his hands. Nearby, a discarded torch sputtered hungrily on the rocky ground. He dived at the dragon, not knowing the technique was to set the lance and let the dragon come to you. His aim was true, and the lance met the dragon behind the left shoulder blade, where one might hope to reach its heart. However, Briandon hadn't counted on the aureate scales of gold. Tougher than any armour, they turned the blow. Rhys, with 80 pounds of armour, crashed into the side of the dragon amidst the flying shards of both blade and shaft. The dragon whirled, with one great foreclaw swept the Careglass warrior aside. Rhys flew across the cavern and slammed against the solid granite. He hung there against the wall for a second, one gauntlet dropping to clatter to the ground, along with several small clasps that had torn free of his armour. Then he sprawled forward and was still. Garrick reached the dragon's side, limping on the turned ankle. Dragon blood ran to form a pool at his feet. The lance had penetrated before it shattered. From the amount of broken blade on the ground, Garrick estimated half its length must be in the dragon's side. The dragon turned to look at him, and there was fire in those emerald eyes. A moan from across the room, and Rhys was on his feet. As Rhys drew his broadsword, Garrick saw blood running from mouth, nostrils, and both ears. His helm was dented as if it had been hit by a poleaxe. His visor hung to one side, twisted. Drawing back the broadsword, he lunged at the dragon. "No!" Garrick screamed, but it was too late. Rhys was in motion, and the dragon's mouth gaped, flames smouldering hotter than any hell. With no choice, Garrick also moved, rolling under the dragon's belly to reach the dragon's sword. Rhys struck. The blow caught the dragon squarely across the snout. Sparks and blood flew. The dragon roared, and Rhys was enveloped in flame. The force of the blast lifted the warrior and hurled him back a full rod, where he somehow landed on his feet. His screams, as fire consumed those areas not covered by armour, jarred loose stalagmites that had hung for thousands of years. Even as the flames erupted from the dragon's mouth, Garrick struck. The dragon sword bit with a solid thunk into the beast's neck and held there. The dragon spun about, snapping the blade and slamming its head full into Garrick. He saw the shattered sword hilt spinning away just before he struck the cavern wall. Everything went black. Some time later, hours or days he couldn't have said, he felt something nuzzling against his side and came around. He opened his eyes to gaze into those of the unicorn. The side of her white muzzle was streaked with red blood. Shattered innocence, Garrick thought to himself. He rolled to a sitting position, crying out as broken ribs grated together. His head spun, and for a moment he almost went back under. Then the cavern quit spinning, and he was able to stay up by leaning on the foal. Vision cleared, and he looked upon the carnage. The mess against the far wall had been Rhys Briandon. A few flames still licked hungrily at the remains. Nearer lay the dragon. Its head was stretched full upon the cave floor, the emerald eyes watching him intently. From the wound in its neck pumped a river of blood. Garrick discovered he was sitting in the continuously spreading pool of dragon blood. The unicorn's hooves were red with it. The dragon spoke first. It was no longer the powerful voice Garrick had grown accustomed to.
"Not what I had expected from a dragon slayer of your reputation, Eberron."
Garrick crawled closer, aware of the fact that he'd already been dead if that had been the dragon's intentions. In moving, he discovered one leg was broken. He moaned with the pain, but crawled anyway. The same leg had been broken before. He reached the dragon's head and surveyed the damage there. The dragon would raid no more flocks.
"Move to protect the other men,"
the dragon said it for him.
"Instinct. Even as when I torched him, we are both driven by those instincts. It's the only way both of us have survived to become what we are. The last."
The emerald eyes lifted to the unicorn, then waited, uncertain of her own fate in this haven-turned slaughterhouse.
"Take her, Garrick Eberron. She has none of the warrior instincts that have allowed both of us to survive."
"Is there anything I can do for you?"
"Nothing, human. Asking that shows me I've at least changed you from the man who came in here for my blood.
Leave now while I have the strength to seal these caverns behind you. I'll not have the peasants down here after my head when I'm gone.
Dragging his bagged leg, Garrick found the largest piece of the spear's shaft and used it for a crutch. Slowly, in great pain, he got to his feet and made his way towards the lair's exit. At the tunnel, he turned back and called for the unicorn, the fragile creature looking to the dragon, and some unspoken communication seemed to pass between them. Then the unicorn trotted through the blood to join Garrick. Garrick turned to leave, but the dragon called him back.
Do me one favor,
It bade him. Name it.
The others will forget. Humans have never wanted to believe in things of magic. Dragons, unicorns, fairy elves. But you know different. Remember me as I was, Eberron.
I will.